Hi, this is the podcast for Dr. Sambaluk's 23 March 2016 course on World War I. We left off with the French Army mutiny, having been closed up by Pétain's reforms, his carrot and stick approach to reforms that would reinstill discipline in the army. And we said that both Russia and France were incapable for domestic reasons of launching major offensive actions in the second half of 1917. But Britain did wage two important offensive campaigns during that time. One of them was aimed to secure what Haig had desired the previous year, and that was the possession of key naval facilities on the Belgian coast, which would hinder the U-boat effort that the Germans were undertaking. The second of these aimed to seize tactically important ground through the experimental use of emerging war technologies that were paired up with new tactics. So it's important to give these a little shout out before we approach the main topic for Wednesday's lecture, which is the instability in Russia in 1917. Regarding Britain and its campaigns, the first of these was called the Battle of Passchendaele, also called Third Battle of Ypres, also referred to by the British as Third Wipers. It had an ambitious aim, and that was to drive the Germans out of the Belgian coast. Success would have had two important results. First, in strategic terms, the liberation of the Belgian ports would mean choking off the most westerly U-boat bases that the Germans possessed, thus helping to protect Allied and neutral shipping bound for Britain. Second, liberating more of Belgium would have positive political repercussions both amongst the Belgians themselves and the citizenry of neutral countries that were sympathetic to the plight of the Belgians as an occupied people. By liberating the western coast, the British might be attacking a place also that could be secured and held, rather than a salient that might find itself under attack from the flanks. A question that I believe Kieran brought up pretty importantly last time we had class. To support the overall series of attacks, the British needed to capture the Messines Ridge, Messines, the Messines Ridge, south of Ypres. The British again turned to mining to assault the Messines Ridge, and this time they dug 21 big mines under the German positions, altogether packed with a total of 1 million pounds of explosives. All but two of the mines did detonate properly, and the attack made good ground on the first day. And fighting on the next 9 days worked to secure the far side of the ridge, which the German second line of defenses could observe and bring under fire, but which the obstructed British guns were less able to support. The amphibious action that was supposed to coordinate with the big attack along this coastal region to help threaten the Germans with a coastal envelopment had to be cancelled, but the main overland attacks did go forward at 3rd Ypres or Passchendaele. This battle officially began on 31 July and lasted through 10 November. 10 days after its end, the British launched another attack slightly to the southeast at a place called Cambrai, Cambrai. This was the first time that tanks were employed in what we might call combined arms warfare. Although the British had used a small number of experimental tanks or land battleships in the middle of the Battle of the Somme in September of 1916, it was at Cambrai in late November 1917 that tanks were first used truly in concert with other military elements, in particular with close infantry support. The British had learned from the Somme that isolated tanks might scare a few Germans, but were vulnerable to plucky defenders. So the British began employing tanks and infantry more or less together, separated by between 100 and 300 yards depending on the unit. When friendly infantry were relatively close by, German infantry were unable to get really close enough to damage a tank. And by keeping the objective manageable, by ensuring that tanks and infantry each lent their strengths to the other, and by amassing a stunning 476 of the machines, the British were able to, in a week of fighting, successfully gain ground at Cambrai in a local attack. Now, during the next 10 days, however, unexpectedly fierce German counterattacks ejected the British from all of the land that they gained and in fact pushed them back slightly. Cambrai was not a bloody battle by World War I standards. The losses on either side were about 30,000 dead and wounded, certainly a lot of people. But by the First World War standards, this was a relatively small battle. The importance, of course, is the role of tanks being used in combined arms warfare. That's really why Cambrai merits particular mention in such a vast war. Cambrai saw a successful attack by the British and a successful counterattack by the Germans. And although the positions on the eve of the battle and in the aftermath of the battle were essentially the same, both sides saw Cambrai as a promising signal that they had cracked the problem of positional warfare. And that's crucial. Turning to Russia. All of the first-generation combatant nations in the First World War had entered because of a belief that their security and maybe even their existence was at stake. Now, arguably, the Russian Tsar Nicholas II's decision to mobilize his army was the key trigger in transforming an Austro-Serb war into the First World War. Although it did not directly cause the war to become a global conflict, Russian mobilization certainly did lead immediately to an expansion of the war from the Balkan region into the entire European continent. Nicholas II and his advisors had been prompted by concern about the weakness of Russia and by its need for allies as a result of its weakness, and by its desperate need for geopolitical credibility as a result of that. Russia had underperformed in the Crimean War of the 1850s. It had underperformed in the Turkish War of the 1870s. It had underperformed in the Japanese War of the early 1900s. Russia and its neighbors were noticing a pattern here. And, of course, Russia stood completely aside when Austrian expansion put even more of the Austrian Empire's resources on Serbia's doorstep in 1908. Russian weakness had given confidence to its assertive opponents and had helped the Bulgarians drift away from what had been a friendly relationship between the two Slavic kingdoms of Bulgaria and Russia. There are, in a sense, two ways of interpreting Russia on the international stage at the beginning of the 20th century. One is essentially a function of accounting up Russian resources, including people, and the other relates to the ratio amongst these things within the country. Russia's enemies feared that she would become a military steamroller. Once its enormous human strength were matched up with a comparatively incremental boost in its industrial and logistical capacity. German planners shortly before the war believed that, barring unexpected events, Russia might reach this situation by 1917, and that would be incredibly dangerous for Germany. Now, in our course, 1917 had arrived, but the intervening years had brought seemingly nothing but unexpected events. Russian losses in 1914 probably approached about 1 million. Their records are poor, but we think that about 1 million Russians were killed or wounded or captured in 1914 alone. Russia had lost 3.5 million in 1915. In 1916, Russia had lost about 500,000 men in the success of the Brusilov offensive alone. Hindenburg's twin victories a month into the war had cost the Russians, back in 1914, had cost the Russians about 300,000. Mackinson's 1915 offensive may have inflicted as many as 400,000 lost soldiers in its first month of fighting alone. So a lot of these casualties are suffered in big battles, but there's always that grinding wastage of personnel going on all the fronts. War breeds shortage, and failure breeds recrimination. Russia did not produce enough rifles for soldiers to carry, enough bullets for them to shoot, enough gas masks for them to wear during attack. But the Tsar clung tenaciously to the obligations that his country had within the Entente coalition. In a sense, that was a strategic move, because Russian economic buildup had been stunted by the war's outbreak, and Russia was dependent during the war, and was likely to be so after it, upon the Western industrialized democracies, its coalition partners. Since Tsarist absolutist monarchy was so far divorced from the culture and norms that the democracies actually sympathized with, the Tsar needed a trump card, his strategic value, as a way of ensuring their continued assistance. In another sense, this was perhaps a noble move, because Nicholas II saw himself as closely linked with his people and felt that his country's suffering was a personal sacrifice on his part. But in another sense, it was a rather stupid and a rather brutal move, since no amount of the Tsar's sympathy really equated to an understanding of what it meant to lose sons at the front, or watch friends cut to pieces, or suffocate in a gas attack, or freeze to death under enemy gunfire. Tragically, in an effort to personally lead his country, the Tsar had, lacking any practical military experience, placed himself in command of his armies and placed his ethnically German wife in charge of domestic affairs. Her cultural ties to the main enemy attracted the resentful suspicion, probably an unfounded suspicion, but nonetheless suspicion of many Russians, and her growing reliance on an Orthodox priest who turned out to be more of a womanizing mystic, and this is Rasputin, caused many other problems as well. Shortages in the big cities were partly a product of the distortions of an economy in wartime, as production shifted to try to meet military needs and did not always answer civilian requirements well at all. Inadequate logistical and organizational systems also contributed to the privations. These led to angry urban protests in the Russian capital called Petrograd, named after Peter the Great. This is now St. Petersburg. It's also the city known as Leningrad during the communist era. The war saw urban protests in some cities of most of the combatant countries, including France, including Britain, including Germany. The most common response was a mix, in these other countries, was a mix of minor material concession and of repression of anti-war efforts. In Russia, though, there was little to give, so the absence of a carrot meant that the regime in Russia could offer only the stick by itself. On 8 March 1917, also 23 February by the old Gregorian calendar that Russia was essentially alone and still using, one of the protests was met by soldiers who refused to fire into the crowd of hungry women in Petrograd, and instead they turned their guns on their officers and they supported the protest. The protest had suddenly and spontaneously become a revolution. The defection of army units stunned the Russian government. Within days, the Tsar abdicated his own power and his son's heirship, and the Tsar's brother Michael did similarly. Russia was now, for the first time in its national history, a republic. A provisional government was established under Alexander Kerensky, K-A-R-E-N-S-K-Y. Kerensky was a relatively moderate figure within Russia's Socialist Revolutionary Party, its name notwithstanding. The Duma, or parliament in Russia, had existed as window dressing since 1905 for a limited franchise that allowed a relative handful of Russian people to vote for a parliament that lacked any effective governing powers. People who had actual government experience had been solely voicing constituent concerns without any real power to act, but they'd been voicing these concerns. But now that the revolution had toppled the Tsar and given way to a provisional government, a Republican provisional government without a king, these people who had been kind of voicing the concerns of a voting minority now found themselves in charge of a country, and a vast country at that, the largest contiguous landmass on Earth, and a country that was in the middle of history's most devastating war to date. Toppling the Tsar had come shockingly swiftly and easily, But Nicholas II's abdication did not win a single victory on the battlefield, nor did it build a single new factory or plow a single new field. Kerensky's provisional government faced the same problems that the Tsar had, except the provisional government, on the one hand, might be able to alter national policy, and on the other hand, could not effectively alter national policy without building internal coalitions, which an autocratic Tsar had never felt obliged to do. Perhaps the most urgent question was whether Russia would remain in the war. Despite the war's distinct unpopularity in Russia, the strategic pull to remain in the conflict and aligned with the Allies still held true. Policymakers in the other Allied capitals hoped that the provisional government would be more competent than the Tsar's regime, and ordinary people in the other Allied countries were glad that their Russian ally was no longer an embarrassing absolute monarch who seemed almost a throwback to the 17th century. Russia was unable to extricate itself from the war, but it was also unable to really prosecute the war in any effective way either. When General Lavra Kornilov, Kornilov is Kornilov, when General Lavra Kornilov used a frontline army that was supposed to fight the Germans to instead march back toward Petrograd, Kerensky smelled a rat. Kornilov seemed bent on overthrowing the provisional government and replacing it. With what? Himself? A military regime? A reinstated Tsar? None of these possibilities were something that Kerensky was willing to welcome or even to entertain. So Kerensky hurriedly mobilized what he could manage to assemble to defend the capital against Kornilov's likely coup attempt. This meant suddenly and reluctantly inviting a group called the Bolsheviks to greater stature. Most of the Tsar's critics had been socialists of one kind or another, and the political left in the early decades of the 20th century was rife with fractures and splits that led to very bitter hostilities between factions within the left wing. The Bolsheviks were a particularly militant, violent, and vindictive left-wing splinter group within this broader assemblage of socialist political parties. The leadership of this small militant fringe element had been swept from Russia by the Tsarist regime and had taken refuge in Switzerland some years before the First World War began. The deposing of the Tsar was welcome news to the Germans, but the Kerensky government's decision to continue the war on the side of the Entente was certainly not welcome to the Germans. German diplomats, including the new Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Arthur Zimmermann, decided to try a promising tactic that might undercut Russia's future war-making potential. Germany had quietly encouraged rebellions by Hindus and Muslims and Irish Catholics against the British Empire, but these efforts had really failed to deliver any significant result from the German perspective, and in fact, the real attempts at some kind of British Indian uprising had completely fallen flat. The Ottoman Sultan's proclamation of a jihad and overtures to the King of Afghanistan to invade India had come up short, to say the least. It essentially brought nothing to the table for the Germans' standpoint. But a revolutionary movement planted in an enemy country could do tremendous damage if only the movement could be nurtured to survival. This was something the Germans kept hoping for, and all these attempts just fizzled and fell apart. The Germans covertly smuggled a cadre of these Bolshevik leaders across Central Europe from the Swiss border across the German Empire into Russian-owned Finland. This included a man named Vladimir Lenin, his wife, his mistress, and 24 other Bolshevik radicals returning to Russia, beginning to build a political network of revolutionaries. One can only imagine the train ride between Lenin and his wife and his mistress in the same rail car. Kerensky, his hands full with domestic political squabbling and a war effort and myriad organizational challenges, quickly moved to marginalize the Bolsheviks as soon as they arrived in Russia, and he declared the party illegal in provisional government Russia. But Kornilov's would-be coup attempt confronted Kerensky with the problem of either losing to Kornilov's army or winning by arming every anti-Kornilov person he could find, and that would mean giving guns to the Bolsheviks, and also legal recognition in return for their help. The Kornilov threat evaporated, but the Bolsheviks did not hand back their guns, nor were they easy to re-marginalize after the Kornilov attempt. Nor, either, were the Bolsheviks interested in coalition government or truly democratic politics. As Kerensky struggled to hold power and continue an unpopular war effort, many people began to wonder what the point had been of toppling the Tsar, only to get a new ruler who still kept the country in the war, disastrously. In the fall of 1917, Lenin's group increasingly harangued that political reform depended upon the workers' councils. The workers' councils in Russia were known by the term Soviets, S-O-V-I-E-T-S. And Soviets, when it is in lowercase, means workers' councils. If you see Soviets in a capitalized form, it refers to the movement and especially the government of the Soviet Union, which does not yet exist in our, we've not yet gotten to that. But Lenin's group of Bolsheviks increasingly harangued that meaningful political reforms had to come through the workers' councils, the lowercase Soviets, gaining ever-increasing authority at the expense of the provisional government. It was a ploy. In early November, which is late October according to the old Gregorian calendar that was in use, the Bolsheviks launched a coup not against the Tsar, who had been toppled months earlier, but a coup to overthrow Kerensky's provisional Republican government. The capital fell relatively quickly and without much in the way of fighting or bloodshed at first. The Bolsheviks were now in power in Russia, theoretically. Russia included some really big, important cities like Petrograd and Moscow, but most of Russia, both in terms of land and in terms of people, most of Russia is in the hinterland. The Bolsheviks moved to consolidate their hold over as much as possible of the old Tsarist Empire, but they faced some important obstacles. One was the fragments of the old Russian military, which, together with certain members of the officer corps, remained loyal either to the idea of the Tsarist regime or to some kind of non-communist post-war Russian state, with them holding autonomous or autocratic powers. Much of the peasantry was poor and rural and religiously pious, and little in its peasant outlook sympathized with Marxism, with its materialist conception of society and of human nature, with its violent antipathy for religion, and with its overt prioritization of the urban industrial laboring populations as purer and more politically aware than any other part of the population, including the rural poor. The various portions of the old Tsarist army that were opposed to Lenin and the Bolsheviks were known as Whites. And some of the peasants' groups that resisted Lenin were known as Greens, while the Bolsheviks carrying their red banner of Marxism were known as Reds, a colloquial term for violent leftists throughout the 20th century, a recurring sort of pattern we see in terminology. Although the Reds opposed the Whites and the Greens, the Whites and the Greens did not effectively line up with each other, and sometimes different groups of Whites showed little impulse to cooperate with each other, and the so-called Green movement amongst the peasantry, this too was much less unified than we might at first glance imagine. What they shared was an antipathy of Lenin, not a vision of the future. Some of the left-wing press, such as American journalist John Reed, hurried to romanticize the Bolsheviks, the Reds, but the situation in Russia was defined by chaos and by continued suffering. These romanticized images, notwithstanding, they just were not accurate. From Lenin's perspective, success would mean seizing control of enough of the world that Bolshevism would gain a strong base from which to launch a revolutionary Marxist crusade. That's what Lenin wanted to achieve. Within even the Bolshevik movement, a three-way cleft emerged about how quickly this might be contemplated. So-called right-wing Bolsheviks thought that it could be done only much, much later after a lot of consolidation and preparation. Center Bolsheviks wanted the same thing. They wanted world revolution, but they were opportunistic as well as cautious about the pace of the future events to unfold. Left Bolsheviks believed that the faster a world revolution was launched, the greater its chance for success. So they all agree, all these Bolsheviks, left, right, and center, agree on what they ultimately want to achieve, but not about the pace of how to achieve it. The immediate challenges for the Bolsheviks were administrative and military. Lenin tackled many of the former while leaving the left Bolshevik leader Leon Trotsky, Trotsky, to prepare an army capable of addressing the latter group of challenges. What was known as the Red Army was at first a peculiar assortment of people who the Bolsheviks thought would be militarily useful and politically expedient to give weapons to. Now remember, the Bolsheviks have recent experience in recognizing that giving weapons to untrustworthy people can be very dangerous. After all, the Bolsheviks' first weapons that they got a hold of was because Kerensky had given them weapons under duress. So the Reds, the Bolsheviks, were very cautious about how much they could trust the people they were arming. They had come to power by betraying people who they had been armed by. And the founder of communism, Karl Marx, had himself urged communists from the very get-go in the mid-19th century to actively make alliances of expediency and then betray their former colleagues. This was really the rule in the rule book of the Bolsheviks. The solution to the problem of political reliability included the introduction of the formal commissar system, in which Red Army units had a military commander who was matched in rank and authority by a political officer whose loyalty to the Bolshevik regime was beyond reproach and who had the legal authority to veto any command given by a trained and competent military officer who may or may not have any Bolshevik sympathies. The commissar system is one of the most significant innovations of the Soviet regime, and it is a reflection of the way in which the Soviet leaders, from the very beginning of their reign, needed military power for use against their domestic and foreign political enemies, and yet they felt themselves vulnerable to the kinds of betrayal that their own political theorists and progenitors had insisted were legitimate and useful tools. The Bolsheviks had several enemies, but only one institution of the Red Army. The Whites, the Greens, the Germans, the small foreign contingents that had been dispatched to the Russian port towns to try to guard against the Bolsheviks, these were all dangers to the regime. Trotsky and Lenin saw the first priority as gaining power within the rump, as much as possible, of the Russian Empire, and Russia devolved into a civil war that would really not completely close out until 1923, even though its ending phases were pretty apparent by the fall of 1922. During these events, the German leaders had to decide what to do about Eastern Europe. After backing so many fizzled revolutions throughout the empires of their other enemies, the Germans may have been surprised to find that the Bolsheviks had already been so quickly successful. Bolshevism was antagonistic to all of the economic, political, and religious systems in existence in the entire rest of the world. And that cannot be emphasized clearly enough. The Bolsheviks were inimical. They were enemies to every existing political, economic, religious, moral, and philosophical structure that was in power the rest of the planet over. And they're now on the border, on the eastern border of Germany. Germany now had a failed state with a Bolshevik regime on its eastern frontier. German leaders had wanted to overthrow Russia to toss it out of the war, but this was a very strange situation. German leaders hoped to gain as much as possible from the instability in Russia by accessing the resources of Russia's western provinces. This would alleviate the hardships of the Allied blockade. And second, the Bolshevik regime had to be prevented from threatening the Second Reich, the Kaiser's Germany, had to somehow be insulated against this Bolshevik menace that the Germans hadn't themselves facilitated. Trotsky, unable to fight the Germans, but unwilling to negotiate with them, wanted a Bolshevik policy that he called no war, no peace. Under this policy, the Bolsheviks waged their civil war against the whites and the greens, but ignored the Germans for the time being. Because remember, world revolution is to be pending, but not quite yet. Hold it off until the civil war in Russia has completed. The problem was that German policy could not be ignored. Germany divided its Eastern Front armies into basically two components in 1917. The younger personnel were prepared for combat on the Western Front. We'll talk about that later, next time. The older and less fit troops were kept in the East to promote German interests in Western Russia. This included the requisition of agricultural goods and raw materials to support both the German home front and the front line for Germany. It also involved the sponsorship of nationalist governments in many of the old western provinces of the Russian Empire to build buffer states, a sort of an insulation for Germany from the Bolsheviks. This included the establishment of an independent, nominally independent, Poland, something that the Germans had been promising to ethnic Poles like Józef Pilsudski, Pilsudski, in exchange for these ethnic Poles serving the German army, and which, of course, the Germans had theoretically created in the fall of 1916 with the establishment, first of all, of a Polish banking system. Nominally independent, but in effect beholden to the Germans, and so autonomous in name only. These new countries in Eastern Europe were to be independent of Russia, but subservient to Germany, and were to be a built-in cushion in the western portions of what had been the Russian Empire. When Trotsky's no war, no peace idea came up against German activity in Eastern Europe, the result was that the nationalist groups began building lots of regimes separate from Bolshevik power and friendly to the German government across much of Western Russia. As a left Bolshevik, Trotsky believed that a world revolution could be undertaken within a matter of months. He was initially very confident that an imminent world revolution would make this loss of Western Russia just be a minor, temporary setback. But the national leader, Lenin, had to stop these massive losses of territory, because even though Eastern Europe was not much of Russian total geography, it did hold disproportionate amounts of the old Tsarist Empire's people, raw materials, agricultural potential, industry, which was of course very limited to get from the beginning, and logistical infrastructure. All this stuff would be lost if more and more buffer states subservient to the Germans were established out of Western Russia in Eastern Europe. So Lenin had already promised what he called peace, land, and bread to the Russian people as part of his political ploy for gaining popularity. And now had come to preside over civil war. Renewing war against Germany was not really a feasible option. It had, after all, been what led to the toppling of the Tsar in the spring of 1917, what had allowed the unpopularity of Kerensky to pave the way for the Bolshevik coup in the end of 1917. It was not an option to go fighting the Germans again. But what the Bolsheviks could do was cut an expedient short-term deal with the Germans. This is what the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Brest-Litovsk, named for a city in modern Poland where it was signed. The Germans got Bolshevik promises to respect the sovereignty of the successor states, these buffer states that were set up in Eastern Europe, and that the Germans had carved out of that western quarter of the old Tsarist Empire. This gave the Germans an opportunity to de facto govern the lands of modern Ukraine, Poland, the western half of Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Bolsheviks, in their turn, got a German guarantee not to impinge further on Russian territory, not to build any more successor states in Western Russia. It was a bargain, frankly, that was signed by liars, as both sides agreed to it only in the short term and without any permanent loyalty to its provisions. Both the Kaiser's Germany and Bolshevik Russia intended to abrogate this treaty, to break this treaty at the first reasonable opportunity. Both, in fact, agreed to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk really because they believed that at the moment they were too weak to successfully go farther. And so this was as much as they could get in the short term before dealing with their existing travails and enemies, and they would turn, break this treaty, and then crush their enemies, whether it be the Bolsheviks on the part of the Germans or the Germans on the part of the Bolsheviks. In fact, by 1919, the Bolsheviks were crushing Ukraine. As an independent state, it ceased to be in 1919. And in 1920, the Soviet Union would attempt to eradicate the state of Poland, leading to a war from 1920 to 21 in which the Soviet Red Army reached the very gates of the Polish capital of Warsaw on the Vistula River before being turned back by a Polish army. This was, in fact, in 1920-21, a Soviet attempt at crushing Central and Western Europe, starting with the eradication of Poland. Both sides would come to be disappointed by Brest-Litovsk, both the Germans and the Bolsheviks, as it did not bring either of them what they had secretly desired. World revolution was not quite as imminent as the left Bolsheviks had confidently expected. At least, the imminent revolutions were not mostly successful ones when they did occur. The Germans, for their part, never quite could extract the amount of supplies from Eastern Europe that they really wanted to access. And the burden of coercing the successor states with an occupation army was an ongoing and surprisingly extensive and expensive proposition, even if it was one that could be fulfilled mostly by middle-aged second echelon troops whose fighting skills would have been of limited utility on the Western Front. Thanks for listening. I look forward to being together again on Friday when we can explore the development of stormtroop tactics in the German army, a bit about why they were able to turn back the British tide at Cambrai that we mentioned at the beginning of this hour, and what the Germans intended to do with these new troops and tactics armed with largely cutting-edge technologies. We'll go ahead and explore that next time. I'll see you then.